The red dust of the Arizona territory had a way of getting into everything. It settled in the lines of a person's face, coated the back of their throat, and worked its way into the seams of their clothing until the very fabric seemed to be spun from the baked earth itself. At Dry Willow Station, a solitary outpost blistering under the August sun, the dust was a constant companion. It was in the air Ruth Ann Miller breathed as she stood over a cast-iron pot, stirring the thick bean stew that had been simmering for hours. The heat from the wood stove was a physical presence in the small kitchen, a heavy blanket that smelled of mesquite smoke, boiling beans, and the faint, sharp scent of the chili peppers she had chopped fine. Ruth Ann wiped a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of her forearm, her movements economical and practiced. She was a woman built for work, not for show. Her calico dress was faded but clean, her brown hair pinned up in a practical knot that stray tendrils were already escaping. She had come west from a place with green trees and 4 distinct seasons, seeking a life she could build with her own 2 hands, a place where a woman's worth was measured by her labor, not by the man she belonged to. Arizona was teaching her that worth was measured mostly in survival. The clatter of boots on the porch announced the arrival of the railroad men, their foreman. A man named Fletcher, who worked for the contractor Silas Crowley, pushed through the door without knocking. He filled the doorway, blocking the meager light, his shadow falling across the clean-swept floorboards. "Smells good in here." "Ruthie," he said, his voice overly familiar. He leaned against the doorframe, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Smells like you were expecting us." "The stage is late," Ruth Ann said, not turning from her stove. "The stew is for the passengers." "Passengers can wait. The men building this railroad need feeding." He took a step inside, bringing the smell of sweat and cheap whiskey with him, and a little hospitality besides. Ruth Ann finally turned, a long wooden spoon held loosely in her hand. Her face was calm, her blue eyes direct. "There's coffee on the stove, and there's water in the barrel. Help yourself. The stew is spoken for." Fletcher's smile was thin. "I wasn't talking about the stew." He let his gaze wander over her, an appraisal that made her skin feel tight. "A pretty thing like you, all alone out here. Must get lonely. Some of the boys think you're putting on airs. I told them you're just shy. Maybe you're putting a little something extra in the cooking. Hey, a little sweetening to charm a man." The accusation was ugly and familiar, because she kept to herself, because she did not drink the liquor they offered or laugh at their coarse jokes. Whispers had started. They twisted her quiet dignity into something suspect, something unnatural. "The only thing I put in my cooking is salt and pepper, Mr. Fletcher. Now, if you'll excuse me, this needs stirring." She turned back to the pot. A clear dismissal. The air thickened with his resentment. He lingered for another moment before turning and stomping back out onto the porch. Through the open door, Ruth Ann could hear his voice, low and carrying. "See too good for us. Thinks she's some kind of saint. But I tell you, there's a spell in that pot. A woman like that, she has her ways of getting what she wants." Ruth Ann's shoulders tightened, but she kept stirring. The rhythmic scrape of the spoon against the iron was a small, steady anchor in a world that felt increasingly adrift. She had left the East to escape judgment, only to find it had a longer reach than she had imagined. Here, it just wore a different hat. A few minutes later, another shadow fell across the doorway. This one was different. It did not fill the space with brute force, but rather with a quiet intensity. Ruth Ann looked up to see a man standing there, his frame lean and hard. He was Navajo, his face a map of sun and wind, his black hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He moved with a liquid grace that made Fletcher seem like a clumsy bear. There was a long, fresh scratch along his jaw, a thin line of red against his brown skin, and his eyes, dark and sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. He took in the kitchen, the pot on the stove, and finally, Ruth Ann herself. He did not speak. She felt a different kind of awareness, not the bristling defensiveness Fletcher provoked, but a still curiosity. She gestured with the spoon toward the coffee pot. He gave a slight shake of his head and stepped inside, moving to one of the small, empty tables. He sat and placed his hands on his knees, waiting. His silence was not empty. It was watchful, patient. Ruth Ann understood. She took a clean bowl from the shelf, ladled it full of the thick, savory stew, and took a piece of cornbread from the warmer. She set the meal down in front of him. He looked from the bowl to her face, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He ate with the same focused economy with which she cooked. There was no wasted motion. When he was finished, he pushed the clean bowl away and looked at her again. "Good cook," he said. The words were quiet, a low rumble. He reached into a small pouch at his belt, but she held up a hand. "No charge," she said. "You look like you needed it." He considered her for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. His name, she would learn later, was Atsa Nez. In that moment, he was just a stranger who saw her for what she was, a cook. Not a saint, not a witch, just a person who knew her way around a stove. It was the truest compliment she had received in months. The fragile peace was shattered by a sudden thunder of hooves and the frantic rattling of a coach. A dust-choked stagecoach careened into the station yard, its horses wild-eyed and lathered. The driver was shouting, his words lost in the panic, but the sounds from inside the coach were terrifyingly clear, the high, thin screams of children. "They're coming! The Black Spurs!" a voice shrieked from the driver's box. Before the coach had even skidded to a halt, the passenger door flew open and 3 small figures tumbled out, 2 girls and a boy, none older than 13, their faces pale with terror. They scrambled toward the boarding house, the only sanctuary in sight. Everything seemed to happen at once. Gunshots cracked in the distance. The railroad men on the porch scattered, diving for cover. Hannah Mayfield, the station's owner, appeared in the main doorway, her face a mask of disbelief. Ruth Ann did not hesitate. Her body moved before her mind had a chance to weigh the danger. She ran to the door, grabbing the arm of the oldest girl. "In here, the kitchen now." She pulled them into her domain, her sanctuary of heat and steam. The children huddled behind her, their small bodies trembling. They were orphans, she realized, their clothes worn and patched, their faces smudged with dirt and tears. They were cargo, being shipped to some unknown future, and that future was now being chased by men on horseback. Through the front window, she could see them now, a handful of riders closing in, their faces obscured by bandanas. They were not aiming to kill. Not yet. They were hurting, enjoying the fear. Ruth Ann's mind raced. There was no lock on the kitchen's back door, only a simple latch. It led to the open scrubland behind the station. No cover, no escape. Her eyes fell on the heavy pot of beans, still bubbling on the stove. It was her work, hours of it. It was meant to be dinner. Now, it was a weapon. Atsa was on his feet, moving silently to the front of the boarding house. He did not draw a weapon. He simply melted into the shadows of the main room, becoming a part of the building itself. One of the riders dismounted and kicked in the front door. Another was right behind him. "They're in here, grab the kids!" As the first man stormed into the common room, Ruth Ann acted. She grabbed 2 thick cloths, lifted the heavy iron pot from the stove, and staggered with it to the back door. With a grunt of effort, she flung the door open. Seeing 2 more riders circling around, she heaved the entire contents of the pot outward in a wide, steaming arc. The boiling hot stew hit the dusty ground with a furious sizzle, throwing up a dense cloud of steam and smoke. It smelled of chili and fear. The men's horses shied violently at the sudden eruption, whinnying and rearing. One of the riders, his face now spattered with hot beans, cursed and fought to control his mount. The screen of steam gave them a few precious seconds of confusion. At the front, the first bandit charged into the common room and was met not by a bullet, but by a ghost. Atsa moved from the shadows like a striking snake. He used the man's own forward momentum against him, a fluid redirection of energy that sent the bandit crashing headfirst into a wall. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. The second bandit, drawing his pistol, found his wrist seized in a grip of iron. There was a sharp twist, a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the floorboards. Atsa struck the man once at the base of his skull with the edge of his hand, and he collapsed on top of his partner. It was over in less time than it took to draw a breath. It was brutal, efficient, and utterly silent. The chaos outside subsided as quickly as it began. The remaining riders, seeing their men dispatched and their element of surprise lost, hesitated. This was supposed to be easy. This was not part of the plan. After a moment of uncertainty, they wheeled their horses around and galloped back into the desert, leaving 2 of their own lying unconscious in the dust and 2 more on the floor of the boarding house. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the ragged sobbing of the youngest child. Ruth Ann stood in the back doorway, her hands empty, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ground was littered with beans. Minutes later, another rider appeared. This one wore a tin star on his vest. Sheriff Asa Boone rode in at a lazy trot, his expression not one of urgency, but of annoyance. He surveyed the scene, the groaning men on the floor, the terrified children, Hannah Mayfield trying to calm them, and Ruth Ann standing amid the wreckage of her kitchen. Fletcher, the railroad foreman, emerged from wherever he had been hiding. Sheriff, it was her, he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Ruth Ann. She started the whole thing, attacked these men without provocation, caused a riot. Sheriff Boone dismounted, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Ruth Ann. Is that so, ma'am? You're looking at a charge of disturbing the peace. Assault. Even? Before Ruth Ann could find her voice, Atsa stepped forward from the shadows. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, then at the sheriff. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. They ride for Crowley. He said, I have seen them at the railroad camp. They are not black spurs. They are his men. The sheriff's gaze flickered. A flash of something anger, or perhaps fear, crossed his face before it was replaced by a mask of authority. I don't care who they ride for. This woman caused a public disturbance. That's my business. She was protecting these children, Hannah Mayfield snapped, stepping in front of Ruth Ann. Hannah was a widow in her 30s, a woman who had learned to be tough to survive. Those men were chasing them. We all saw it. Are you blind? Asa. Watch your tone. Hannah, the sheriff warned. I'll sort this out. But this woman, he jerked his chin toward Ruth Ann, is going to have to answer for her part in it. Ruth Ann looked from the corrupt sheriff to the frightened faces of the children, then to the quiet, watchful presence of the Navajo warrior who had fought alongside her. She had come to this dusty, forsaken place seeking peace, a small corner of the world to call her own. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. She had not chosen this fight, but it had come to her door all the same, arriving in a cloud of dust and panic, smelling of gunpowder and spilled beans. And now, she was in the middle of it. The argument on the porch of Dry Willow Station was their cover. As Sheriff Boone postured and threatened, his attention fixed on Hannah Mayfield's defiant stand. A new figure emerged from the stables. He was a boy of about 17, wiry and quick, with a sun-weathered face and dark, lively eyes. His name was Miguel Ortega, and his loyalty belonged to Hannah and the station, not to any tin star sheriff or railroad boss. He caught Atsa's eye with a nearly imperceptible nod and motioned toward the back of the building. There was no time for deliberation. Atsa took the boy, Jonas Pike, by the shoulder. Ruth Ann gathered the 2 smaller girls, Emma June and Ruthie Bell, herding them toward the kitchen. She grabbed a half-full sack of flour, 2 canteens, and a bundle of clean cloths from a shelf, her movements swift and automatic. She was a cook. She knew the importance of provisions. Miguel was already at the back door, holding it open a crack, peering out into the twilight. The land behind the station was a ruin of spilled stew. The beans, now cooling into a thick paste in the red dust, were a testament to the afternoon's chaos. Miguel led them out at a half-crouch, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. They skirted the main yard, keeping the low-slung adobe building between them and the sheriff. They moved like ghosts into the deepening shadows of a dry creek bed, the arroyo that snaked its way into the vast, open desert. No one spoke. The only sounds were their hurried footsteps on the loose gravel and the frantic, shallow breaths of the children. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised purple glow on the western horizon. Above, the first stars began to prick the darkening canopy. The air grew cooler, carrying the dry, clean scent of dust and creosote. Towering saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels on the banks of the arroyo, their silhouettes stark against the last light. Atza took the lead without a word being spoken. He moved with a purpose that calmed the frantic beating of Ruth Ann's heart. He seemed to read the land, his feet finding a sure path over the uneven ground. Ruth Ann walked beside Emma June, holding the hand of little Ruthie Bell, whose small legs struggled to keep up. Miguel took up the rear, glancing back every few minutes toward the faint yellow light of the station, a receding island of warmth in an ocean of darkness. For what felt like hours, they walked. The silence of the desert was not empty. It was filled with 1,000 tiny sounds, the scuttling of some unseen night creature in the brush, the distant, mournful howl of a coyote, the whisper of a breeze moving through the skeletal branches of a palo verde tree. The immensity of the landscape was humbling, a vast and indifferent wilderness of rock and sand. To be lost here was to be erased. Ruth Ann focused on the small details, the feel of Ruthie Bell's small, trusting hand in hers, the weight of the flour sack on her shoulder, the steady presence of Atza just ahead of them. He was their compass, their guide in this unforgiving place. Just when the children's steps began to falter from exhaustion, Atza stopped. He held up a hand, and the small procession halted behind him. He scanned the rock formations to their left, his head tilted as if listening for something only he could hear. He moved away from the creek bed, toward a jumble of large, smooth boulders. The others followed, their curiosity overriding their weariness. He stopped before a low, flat rock and, with Miguel's help, rolled it aside. Beneath it was a dark opening, a circular hole cut into the stone. It was a well, an ancient cistern hidden from casual view. Atza took one of the canteens and a rope from his belt, lowering the container into the darkness. It returned heavy and dripping. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of stone and minerals. It was life. Atza poured a small amount into a cup he carried and gave it to the children first, a strict, measured portion for each. Then he passed the cup to Ruth Ann, then to Miguel. He was the last to drink. There were no wasted drops. Every swallow was a prayer. They rested there, in the shelter of the boulders. The children finally succumbing to sleep, huddled together under a thin blanket Ruth Ann had brought. Miguel, his youthful energy seemingly inexhaustible, sat cross-legged, chewing on a piece of dried jerky. He looked at Ruth Ann, a grin flashing in the starlight. He said that bean stew of hers had saved them twice now, once from being captured and once from dying of hunger out here on the trail. But, he added with a wink, the next time she made it, she might consider using a little less salt. Ruth Ann looked at the sleeping children, her expression serious. She answered that the salt was not for flavor. It was to keep a person alive until morning. Miguel's grin faded, replaced by a look of understanding. Atza did not rest. While the others recovered, he circled the area, moving as silently as a shadow. He was gone for some time. When he returned, his face was set in grim lines. He knelt in the sand and drew a shape with his finger. It was a horseshoe, but different from the ones on the station's horses or the stagecoach team. These prints were different, he explained in his quiet, deliberate way. The shoes were heavy, with sharp edges designed to grip on rock. They were not cowboy shoes. They belonged to shoddy horses, ridden by heavy men who did not care for their animals. He had seen shoes like this on the horses of the men Crowley hired to guard the railroad line. The men who had chased the stagecoach were not a random outlaw gang. They were on Crowley's payroll, and they were helping the sheriff. The news settled over their small camp like a shroud, confirming their fears. This was not a simple misunderstanding. They were fugitives in a plot far larger than a disturbance at a remote way station. Ruth Ann hugged her knees to her chest, looking out at the vast, star-littered darkness. It felt like she had been running her whole life. She had left her home in the East for this, for a chance to stand on her own. She spoke, her voice quiet but clear in the still night air. She said she had left because she wanted to find a place where she could make a life for herself without having to ask for anyone's permission, a place where her work was enough. Atza watched her as she spoke, his dark eyes thoughtful. He did not offer words of sympathy. He simply listened, giving her the dignity of being heard. A cool wind began to blow, whispering over the rocks and stirring the fine sand, threatening to foul their precious water source. Acting on instinct, Ruth Ann reached into her bundle and pulled out a square of white cotton, a clean kitchen cloth. She moved to the well and carefully spread the cloth over the opening, anchoring the corners with small, smooth stones. It was a simple, practical gesture, a cook's solution to a desert problem. It was an act of preservation, of protecting the source of their survival. Atza watched her, and a flicker of something like respect softened the hard lines of his face. She was a survivor. Like him. She just used different tools. They slept for a few hours in the pre-dawn chill, a fitful, uneasy rest. The new day arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a sharp, sudden assault. The sky in the east ignited, turning from indigo to a fierce, brilliant orange. The heat of the day was not far behind. They drank another small ration of water, packed their meager supplies, and prepared to move on. Atza led them away from the shelter of the rocks, toward what looked like a more established trail winding through the scrub. They had gone only a few yards when he stopped dead, his body instantly rigid. He held up a hand, and they froze behind him. He pointed to the ground ahead. In the clear, sharp light of the new morning, they saw it. The sun glinted off dozens of points of metal scattered across the path. They were railroad spikes, thick and heavy, driven into the ground at an angle or laid in the dust with their sharp ends pointing skyward. It was not a random scattering. It was a trap, laid for a horse or an unsuspecting traveler in the dark, a cruel, vicious warning. The main trail was impassable. To try and cross it would be madness. Ruth Ann felt a fresh wave of fear. They were being hunted. Atza's gaze lifted from the deadly path to the towering red rock mesas that dominated the landscape to the north. The morning sun cast long, deep shadows at their base. He looked at the shadows, then back at his small, weary group. He told them they would not take the easy trail. They would walk in the shade of the rocks. The path would be harder, the footing treacherous, but it would hide them from view and shield them from the worst of the sun's punishing rays. It was their only chance. Without another word, he turned and started toward the rocks. Ruth Ann took Ruthie Bell's hand. Miguel helped Jonas, and they followed him away from the trap and into the shadows. Their journey had just begun. The town of Dead Juniper did not rise from the desert so much as cling to it. A collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled along a single, wide street of packed red earth. It announced itself not with a welcoming sign, but with the rhythmic, ringing clang of a hammer on steel. That was the first thing they heard, a steady, defiant heartbeat in the oppressive silence. It was the sound of Old Man Whitcomb's blacksmith shop. Atza led them toward it, his steps sure. He guided them past the false front of Lydia Cooper's general merchandise, its windows neatly displaying bolts of cloth and sacks of grain, a fragile outpost of domestic order. On the opposite side of the street, the swinging doors of the Juniper Saloon, owned by Silas Crowley, seemed to absorb the light, promising a darker sort of refuge. People on the boardwalk stopped and stared at their small, ragged party, the stoic Navajo, the weary woman, the nervous boy, and the 3 orphans who looked like lost ghosts. The gazes were curious but not friendly, tinged with a caution that bordered on fear. This was a town that had learned to mind its own business. Whitcomb's smithy was a cavern of welcome heat and shadow, smelling of coal smoke and hot iron. The blacksmith himself was a man forged from the same elements as his trade, with a thick chest, arms like tree limbs, and a beard dusted with soot. He stopped his hammering as they entered, resting the heavy tool on the anvil. His eyes, pale blue in his grimy face, took in the scene with a quick, intelligent appraisal. He looked at Atsa and gave a curt nod of recognition. He said, "You have brought trouble with you, Nez." Atsa's reply was level. "Trouble found us first." Whitcomb's gaze shifted to Ruth Ann and the children. He grunted, a sound of weary acceptance. He told them to come in and get out of the sun. There was a water barrel in the corner. It was clean. The relief of the cool, shaded air was immediate, as the children drank thirstily from a tin dipper. The sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk outside announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Asa Boone filled the wide doorway, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was not alone. 2 of Crowley's railroad guards stood behind him, their expressions blank and brutish. Boone's eyes fixed on the children. He declared that he was there to take custody of the orphans. They were wards of the territory, he said, and he had a place for them at the railroad camp where they would be fed and put to useful work. A cold dread settled in Ruth Ann's stomach. A labor camp. That was his solution. She stepped forward, placing herself between the sheriff and the children. She stated firmly that they would not be going with him. The sheriff's face darkened. He sneered and asked who she was to decide. He accused her of kidnapping them. Whitcomb let his hammer fall to the dirt floor with a heavy thud. The blacksmith said that the children were on his property and under his protection. He advised the sheriff to tread carefully. Boone hesitated, his bluster faltering in the face of the blacksmith's unyielding presence. He was a coward at heart, a bully who only drew strength from his badge and Crowley's backing. He warned them that this was not over. He would be back with a warrant. Then he turned and left, his hired muscle trailing behind him. The immediate threat had passed, but the tension in the forge remained. They were trapped. They could not run, and staying felt just as dangerous. Ruth Ann looked at the faces of the children, their fear now mixed with a fragile hope. They were looking at her. They believed she could protect them. She knew she could not fight men like Boone and Crowley with fists or guns, but she had other weapons. She had flour and fire and a knowledge of how to turn simple ingredients into something that could nourish not just the body, but the spirit. She turned to Whitcomb. She asked if he had a spare fire pit or a grill she could use, and if he knew where she could find some cornmeal. An hour later, in a small, dusty patch of ground beside the smithy, a fire was crackling, using a borrowed skillet and the flour sack she had carried. Ruth Ann began to make cornbread. She mixed the meal with water and a little salt, her hands moving with a familiar, comforting rhythm. Soon, the air was filled with the warm, wholesome scent of baking bread. Miguel, who had a talent for acquiring things, appeared with a sack of coffee beans and a grinder. The rich aroma of fresh coffee soon mingled with the smell of the cornbread. It was an act of defiance, a declaration of life in a town choked with fear. People began to emerge from their homes and shops, drawn by the smells. They were hungry, their face etched with the hardship of life on the frontier. Ruth Ann set up a plank on 2 barrels, creating a simple counter. She charged nothing. She offered a piece of warm bread and a cup of hot coffee to anyone who came. It was a neutral table, a small space governed not by fear or money, but by simple human need. The townsfolk came. They ate the bread and drank the coffee, but they did not meet her eyes. They kept their gazes down, mumbling their thanks before hurrying away. They were afraid to be seen associating with her, afraid of what Crowley or the sheriff might do. Lydia Cooper, the proprietor of the general store, stood in her doorway, watching with a pinched, disapproving expression. She saw a troublemaker, a woman who was upsetting the town's fragile, ugly peace. Then, a man stepped out of the saloon. He moved with an easy confidence that set him apart from the dusty, work-worn townspeople. He wore a fine tailored coat and polished boots, and his face was clean-shaven. It was Silas Crowley. He surveyed the small crowd around Ruth Ann's makeshift kitchen, a slight, unreadable smile on his lips. He approached her table, his presence causing the other townsfolk to melt away into the shadows. He picked up a piece of the cornbread, examining it as if it were a strange curiosity. He said that he had heard she was a good cook. Ruth Ann continued to pour a cup of coffee, her hand steady. She did not answer. Crowley took a bite of the bread and nodded in appreciation. He told her that a woman with her talents was wasted in a place like this. He said he had a proposition for her. His work camps were full of hungry men. They needed a proper cook. He would pay her well, he continued, and provide her with a secure place to live. All her troubles would disappear. The veiled meaning hung in the air between them: work for me, and I will call off my dogs. Ruth Ann looked up from the coffee pot, her blue eyes meeting his. Her voice was quiet, but carried the strength of Whitcomb's iron. She said, "I am not for hire, Mr. Crowley." Silas Crowley's smile did not vanish, but it changed. It grew thin and sharp, losing all its warmth. It was the smile of a wolf that had just seen the door to the sheep pen left open. He said it was a pity. He placed the half-eaten cornbread back on the plank and walked away without another word. While Ruth Ann was fighting her battle in the open, Atza was moving through the shadows. He had seen the railroad depot on the edge of town, a collection of warehouses and sheds surrounded by a high fence. He knew that was the heart of Crowley's operation. He moved with the patient stealth of a hunter, circling the compound, observing the guards, noting their patterns. Later that night, when the town was asleep and a sliver of moon offered little light, he found a place where a loose board in the fence created a narrow opening. He slipped through, a silent wraith in the darkness. He made his way to the largest warehouse, the one marked Supplies. The lock was heavy, but the hasp was set in old, dry wood. A few moments of steady, silent pressure with the tip of his knife, and the screws gave way. Inside, the warehouse smelled of canvas, oil, and metal. In the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, he saw crates stacked high. Most held what he expected: railroad ties, spikes, tools. But in a locked room at the back, he found something else. There were crates of rifles and boxes of ammunition, far more than any railroad crew would ever need for protection. And on a table, weighted down with a rock, were maps. They were survey maps of the area, but they were marked with new lines, claims that extended far beyond the railroad's right-of-way. They followed the path of the only reliable creek in the region, swallowing up the small homesteads and the ancestral lands of his own people. It was a blueprint for theft, drawn up and ready to be filed. At the same time, back at the smithy, Ruth Ann sat with the children, who were huddled around the dying embers of her cooking fire. The youngest, Ruthie Bell, had fallen asleep in her lap. Emma June, the oldest, was still awake, her eyes wide in the firelight. She had been quiet all day, but now, in the safety of the darkness, she began to talk. She whispered to Ruth Ann, her voice a small, trembling thread of sound. She spoke of the journey on the stagecoach, and she spoke of what she had seen at one of the railroad work camps they had passed. She had seen a boxcar, she said, one that was kept locked from the outside. She had heard noises from inside, men's voices, but the guards had chased her away. She said that some of the workers at the camp, the ones who had complained about the low pay or the bad food, they had disappeared. One of the other drivers had told her they were put in the locked car. No one had seen them again. Atza returned to the smithy just before dawn, as silent as he had left. He found Ruth Ann awake, keeping watch over the sleeping children. He told her what he had found: the guns, the maps, the plan to steal the land and the water. She, in turn, told him what Emma June had whispered about the locked boxcar and the men who had vanished. They looked at each other in the gray pre-dawn light, the full and terrible weight of their situation settling upon them. This was no longer just about protecting 3 orphans. It was about a war being waged in secret, a war for the land, the water, and the lives of anyone who dared to stand in Silas Crowley's way. The stakes had been driven deep into the heart of dead juniper, and they were standing right on top of them. The day began with a false peace. A strange, yellowish light filtered down from a sky that looked like bruised pewter. There was no breeze. The air was heavy, still, and hot, pressing down on dead juniper with a suffocating weight. Even the ceaseless clang of Whitcomb's hammer was absent, as if the world was holding its breath. The horses in the town's small corral stood listlessly, their tails limp, their heads bowed. Inside the smithy, the small group felt the oppressive atmosphere. The children were quiet and listless, the heat draining their energy. Ruth Ann found herself constantly wiping sweat from her brow, her movements sluggish. Atza stood in the wide doorway of the forge, staring out at the horizon, his body as still as the air around him. He had been watching the sky all morning, his expression unreadable but intense. He turned from the door and spoke, his voice low and calm, yet it cut through the heavy silence. A storm is coming, a bad one. He directed Whitcomb and Miguel to check the shutters on the main building and secure the horses. He told Ruth Ann to bring the children inside the smithy, away from the windows, and to fill every bucket and basin with water from the barrel. Dust storms were thirsty work. The first sign was a low, distant rumble that was not thunder. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then, the horizon to the west began to darken, not with clouds, but with a solid, churning wall of red and brown. It rose from the ground to the sky, a monstrous, tumbling wave of dirt and sand that was moving toward them with terrifying speed. The wind hit first, a sudden, violent gust that rattled the wooden buildings and sent loose shingles flying. A moment later, the wall of dust slammed into dead juniper. Daylight vanished, plunging the town into a terrifying, sepia-toned twilight. The world shrank to a swirling vortex of grit and howling wind. The sound was deafening, a constant, abrasive roar that vibrated through the floorboards and the very bones of anyone caught inside it. Ruth Ann huddled with the children in the darkest corner of the forge. A damp cloth held over Ruthie Bell's face. Jonas and Emma June pressed close, their eyes wide with fear in the gloom. The air grew thick and tasted of grit. It was in this moment of absolute chaos that Silas Crowley made his move. He had been waiting for just such an opportunity, an act of nature to cover his own malevolent actions, while the townsfolk were blinded and deafened, fighting to keep the desert from invading their homes. 2 of Crowley's men materialized from the swirling dust. They moved with a brutal efficiency, kicking open the smithy's side door. One man grabbed Miguel, shoving him hard against a stack of wagon wheels. The other lunged for the children. He was a large, rough man, and his hand closed on Jonas Pike's arm. Jonas was the oldest, the one who might have seen and remembered the most. He was the most dangerous witness. Jonas cried out, a sound that was swallowed by the storm's fury. The man began to drag him out into the roaring darkness. Ruth Ann screamed and threw herself forward, but the second man blocked her path, his arm like an iron bar across her chest. Miguel struggled, but he was no match for his captor. Atza appeared from the main part of the forge, a dark, furious shape in the maelstrom. He moved with a speed that was almost inhuman. He did not waste time with the man holding Miguel. Instead, he slammed a heavy pair of iron tongs into the man's side. The man grunted in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough for Miguel to break free. But it was too late. The other man had already dragged Jonas out the door and into the heart of the storm. They could hear the boys' shouts being ripped away by the wind. A horse snorted nearby, a sound of panic. They were taking him. Without a second of hesitation, Ruth Ann ran to a peg on the wall and pulled down a thick woolen scarf, tying it tightly around her face, covering her nose and mouth. Her eyes were blazing with a protective fire. She looked at Atsa. He simply nodded. He understood. This was not a choice. It was a necessity. Miguel, his face pale but determined, grabbed a similar cloth. They ran out into the roaring chaos. The force of the wind nearly knocked them from their feet. The air was a painful, blinding blizzard of sand. Visibility was no more than 10 feet in any direction. 3 horses were tethered behind the smithy, their own and one that Whitcomb kept. Atsa untied them with deft fingers, handing the reins of one to Ruth and another to Miguel. As they mounted, Atsa put his mouth close to Ruth Ann's ear, shouting to be heard over the wind. He told her to follow his sounds. She was not to get separated, no matter what. Then he let out a sharp, piercing whistle, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a knife. He spurred his horse forward, disappearing almost instantly into the swirling brown fog. Ruth Ann took a deep breath of gritty air and followed, with Miguel right behind her. They were riding blind into hell. The world was a disorienting nightmare of noise and motion. Ruth Ann could see nothing but the churning dust immediately in front of her. She could feel the stinging impacts of sand against her exposed skin. She rode low over her horse's neck, trusting the animal's instincts and listening for Atsa's signal. Another whistle, sharp and to her left. She guided her horse in that direction, her knuckles white on the reins. It was a desperate chase, a race against an enemy they could not see. They were guided only by sound and faith. Atsa whistled again, a different note this time, 2 short bursts. She saw him gesture with his hand, a quick, sharp motion pointing forward and down. It was a language born of instinct and necessity, a communication that transcended words. He was telling her they were gaining. They rode on, a frantic, ghostly procession through the storm. Suddenly, a shape loomed out of the dust ahead. 2 riders, one with a struggling boy held in front of him. They had found them. The kidnappers, realizing they were being pursued, spurred their horses faster. They were heading out of town, toward the rough, broken country to the east. Atsa gave another whistle, a long, low sound, and gestured again, a circling motion with his hand. He wanted to flank them, to cut them off. Miguel understood instantly. Peeling off to the right, Ruth Ann held her course, trusting Atsa. The ground beneath them grew more treacherous, a landscape of rocks and gullies hidden by the blinding dust. It was a miracle their horses did not break a leg. They were nearing Devil's Split, a deep, jagged canyon that sliced through the landscape. If the kidnappers reached it, they could disappear into its maze of ravines. They had to be stopped now. Atsa spurred his horse into a final, desperate burst of speed. He drew alongside the rider holding Jonas, launching himself from his own saddle in a flying tackle. The 2 men and the boy went down in a chaotic heap, vanishing into the dust. The second rider turned. Pulling his pistol, Ruth Ann saw the movement, a dark shape raising a darker object. She did not think. She spurred her own horse directly at him, screaming with a fury she did not know she possessed. Her horse, sensing her urgency, slammed into the other animal's flank. The man was thrown off balance, his shot going wild, a flash of orange that was instantly swallowed by the storm. Miguel was there a second later, launching himself from his horse and tackling the man before he could recover. They rolled on the ground, a tangle of limbs in the raging wind. Ruth Ann slid from her saddle and ran toward the spot where Atsa and Jonas had fallen. She found Atsa on his feet, pulling the kidnapper up by the collar of his shirt. Jonas was on the ground, shaken and coughing, but unharmed. The storm began to abate as quickly as it had arrived. The wind lessened its scream to a mournful sigh, and the thick dust began to settle. The world slowly reappeared, coated in a fresh layer of red powder. They stood at the very edge of Devil's Split, its dark maw yawning just a few feet away. They had rescued him just in time. When they returned to Dead Juniper, it was to a town transformed. Every surface was painted with a uniform coat of red dust. People were emerging from their homes, blinking in the strange, filtered sunlight. The air was still thick, but the immediate danger had passed. Ruth Ann took stock of the injured. Miguel had a cut on his cheek. One of Crowley's men, the one Atza had struck with the tongs, was nursing his ribs. Another, the one who had tried to shoot Ruth, had a twisted ankle. Without a word, she went to her makeshift kitchen, which was now covered in dust, and began to brush it clean. She stirred the embers of her fire back to life and placed a skillet on top. She made a fresh batch of cornbread. She took the warm bread and a jug of water and went to each of the injured, starting with Miguel, but then moving to the two men who had just tried to kidnap a child and kill her. She offered them water and bread without a word of condemnation. Her actions were simple, direct, and deeply compassionate. Lydia Cooper stood in the doorway of her general store, watching this quiet act of grace. She saw Ruth Ann give a piece of bread to the very man who had held a gun on her moments before. A flicker of confusion, then shame, then something akin to admiration crossed Mrs. Cooper's face. Her tightly held convictions about this strange, troublesome woman began to crumble. This was not the act of an outlaw. It was the act of a decent human being. Later, as darkness fell, Atza found Old Man Whitcomb in his smithy, sweeping out piles of red dust. Atza held out his hand. In his palm lay a spent brass cartridge, something he had picked up from the ground near Devil's Split after the kidnapper's wild shot. Whitcomb took the casing, his eyes narrowing as he turned it over in the lantern light. He pointed to a small, distinctive mark stamped into the brass at the base of the cartridge. He had seen that mark before. He said, his voice a low growl. It was a maker's mark, a custom stamp. It was the mark of the ammunition that Silas Crowley ordered specially for his private guards. Whitcomb looked from the casing to Atza, his expression grim. This was not just a suspicion anymore. This was a seal, a proof. It was the town's own leader, the man who promised progress and prosperity, who was arming the wolves at their door. The dust storm had scoured Dead Juniper, leaving it raw and exposed. In its wake, a fragile quiet settled over the town, the kind that follows a fever. People moved with a weary purpose, sweeping drifts of red dust from their boardwalks, patching torn awnings, and checking on their neighbors. The shared ordeal had momentarily broken down the walls of fear and suspicion. It was this small crack in the town's hardened facade that gave Ruth Ann an idea. She found Old Man Whitcomb in his smithy, methodically cleaning his tools, wiping each hammer and tong free of the fine grit that had invaded his workspace. She stood for a moment, watching his powerful, deliberate hands. He was a man who understood the value of keeping one's tools in order. She told him she had a proposition. She spoke not of justice or rebellion, but of something much more fundamental: hunger. She had seen the tired, drawn faces of the railroad workers who were paid in scrip they could only spend at Crowley's store. She had seen the local Mexican families struggling to stretch their meager harvests. She had seen the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk that made them too timid to demand a fair price for their goods. She wanted to set up a proper kitchen. She explained, not just a temporary fire, a place where anyone could get a hot meal. Whitcomb stopped his work and looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. He asked what she would use for payment. She replied that she would not ask for money. A man could trade an hour of work, mending a fence or stacking firewood. A woman could trade a basket of vegetables from her garden, or a few threads of yarn. A railroad worker could bring a handful of nails he had saved. It would be a kitchen built on what people had to give, not what they were forced to pay. A slow, grudging smile touched the blacksmith's lips. It was a radical idea, a quiet act of revolution that did not require a single gunshot. It undermined Crowley at his very foundation, by making people less dependent on him. Whitcomb told her she could use the lean-to behind the smithy. It had a sturdy roof and a large stone hearth that was used for heating wagon wheels. It would do. And so, the open kitchen was born. Miguel, with his boundless energy and infectious grin, became its chief procurer and ambassador. He spread the word among the Spanish-speaking families and the disgruntled railroad men. Atza, through his own silent channels, let the scattered Navajo families in the surrounding mesas know that there was a place where they would be welcome. At first, people were hesitant. They came cautiously, drawn by the savory smells of stew and fresh bread. But they kept looking over their shoulders, as if expecting Sheriff Boone to appear and arrest them for the crime of accepting a free meal. But Ruth Ann simply smiled, filled their bowls, and asked for nothing. Slowly, they began to trust her. A small community began to form around the stone hearth. A few railroad workers, weary of the maggoty salt pork at Crowley's camp, started spending their evenings there, trading stories for a bowl of chili. An old Mexican woman brought a string of dried peppers and showed Ruth Ann how to grind them into a rich, smoky powder. A young Navajo boy, his shyness overcome by the offer of a warm biscuit, brought a small, skillfully woven basket. The kitchen became a small island of sanity in a town run by greed. It was a place where a person's worth was not measured by the color of their skin or the money in their pocket, but by the simple fact of their existence. It was a family, not of blood, but of shared need and mutual respect. Jonas, Emma June, and Ruthie Bell found themselves with a dozen unofficial aunts and uncles, people who would watch out for them, slip them a piece of hard candy, or teach them a new game. For the first time since they had lost their parents, the children began to laugh again. Ruth Ann was the heart of it all. She moved through the small, bustling space with a quiet grace, her hands always busy, her eyes missing nothing. She learned the names of everyone who came, learned of their troubles and their small joys. She was no longer just the cook from Dry Willow Station. She was the woman who had faced down a dust storm and offered bread to her enemies. She was a force to be reckoned with. Silas Crowley was not a man who tolerated such forces. He watched the daily gathering at the smithy from the window of his saloon, his expression growing colder with each passing day. That kitchen was an insult. It was a declaration that his control over dead Juniper was not absolute, and that was something he could not allow. One night, long after the last visitor had departed and the fire in the hearth had been banked to glowing embers, the threat came. Ruth Ann was cleaning up, wiping down the long wooden table they had built, when a faint sound from outside made her pause. It was the scrape of a boot on gravel, a sound that was too deliberate, too stealthy. She froze, her heart beginning to pound. The children were asleep inside the smithy, safe with Whitcomb nearby. Miguel had gone to his own small room behind the stables. She and Atza were the only ones still awake. He was somewhere in the shadows, as he always was at night, a silent guardian. She forced herself to breathe, to listen. There was nothing but the sound of the wind sighing through the eaves. Perhaps she had imagined it. She turned back to the table, and that is when she saw it. Plunged deep into the wood of the table, quivering slightly from the force of the impact, was a long, wicked-looking hunting knife. Pinned beneath its blade was a small, crudely torn piece of paper. On it, 2 words were written in a stark, angry scrawl. "Get out!" The message was clear. It was not a warning. It was an ultimatum. Atza was beside her a moment later. Appearing so silently, she did not even hear him approach. His eyes took in the knife, the note, and the look of cold fear on Ruth Ann's face. He did not touch the knife. He simply looked at the door, his gaze sweeping the darkness outside. The person who had done this was long gone. He pulled up a stool for her, his movements calm and reassuring. He told her to sit. He said fear was a weapon, and they would not let their enemies use it against them. Tonight, he would teach her to see in the dark. He led her out into the moonless night, into the open space between the smithy and the next building. He told her to close her eyes and listen. At first, all she could hear was the wind, but he guided her, telling her to listen to the way the sound changed as it moved around the corners of the buildings, how it rustled the dry leaves of a scrub brush differently than it whispered through the needles of a pine. The wind, he explained, carried messages. It could carry the scent of a man's sweat or the sound of his breathing long before he was visible. Then he told her to open her eyes and look at the shadows. They were not just patches of blackness. He showed her. They had shapes, depths. A man hiding in a shadow would change its shape. A shadow cast by a building was still and hard. A shadow that held a living thing would seem to breathe, to have a subtle life of its own. He taught her to notice what was out of place. A rock that was not there yesterday, a broken branch on a bush. The desert, he said, always tells a story to those who know how to read it. They spent hours like this, in the quiet darkness, their voices low. He was not just teaching her how to survive. He was sharing a part of himself, his way of seeing the world, and she, in turn, learned to trust his stillness, to understand the deep well of knowledge that lay behind his silent exterior. Their bond grew in these shared moments, forged not by romantic declarations but by the practical necessities of survival. There was no physical touching, no stolen glances. Their intimacy was built in the space between them, in the shared tasks and the growing, unspoken understanding. She began to teach him as well. She showed him how to properly knot the leather ties of a horse's bridle, a skill she had learned from her father. Her small, deft fingers moved with a cook's precision, different from his warrior's strength. He watched her, his focus absolute, and learned. One afternoon, Miguel returned from a trip to the creek with 3 small, silver fish. Ruth Ann decided it was time for Atza to learn a different kind of skill. She laid the fish on a clean board and handed him a small, sharp knife. She showed him how to hold the fish, how to use the back of the blade to scrape away the scales, how to make a clean cut to gut it without piercing the bitter organs. He handled the knife with the same economy of motion he used for everything. But the task was unfamiliar. He was clumsy at first, his large hands struggling with the delicate work. She stood beside him, her arm brushing his as she guided his hand, her voice soft as she explained the process. A faint scent of flower and herbs rose from her skin. He found himself focusing not on the fish, but on the quiet warmth of her presence beside him. For a man who had spent his life in solitude and conflict, this simple, domestic moment felt more profound than any battle he had ever fought. He learned quickly. Soon, he was cleaning the fish with a practiced ease. She seasoned them with salt and wild herbs and showed him how to place them in a covered cast-iron pot with a little water, setting it directly on the hot coals at the edge of the hearth. It was a simple way to cook, a method that required patience and a gentle heat. That evening, they all shared the steamed fish, its meat tender and flaky. It was a small victory, a moment of peace and shared accomplishment in the face of the ever-present threat. As they ate, Ruth Ann looked at Atza. Their eyes met over the flickering firelight. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the same nod he had given her at Dry Willow Station after eating her stew. But this time, it meant something more. It was a recognition not just of a good cook, but of a partner, a true one. The knife in the table was a declaration of war. In the days that followed, an invisible line was drawn down the middle of Dead Juniper's dusty main street. On one side was Silas Crowley's saloon and the sheriff's office, places of shadow and fear. On the other was Whitcomb's smithy and the open kitchen, a small, defiant pocket of warmth and light. The kitchen did more than feed the hungry. It gave them a place to gather, to speak in low tones, to realize they were not alone in their hardship, and Crowley knew it. The memory of Emma June's whispered story about the locked boxcar had settled deep in Ruth Ann's mind. It was a piece of the puzzle that did not fit, a dark shape she could not ignore. The knife had made it clear that they could no longer afford to wait for Crowley to make the next move. They had to find out what he was hiding. One evening, after the last of the kitchen's visitors had departed, Ruth Ann, Atza, and Miguel gathered with Whitcomb around the blacksmith's great anvil, which served as their meeting table. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the stacked tools look like ancient weapons. Ruth Ann spoke first, her voice steady. She reminded them of what the child had seen. A locked car, men who went in and did not come out. It was a risk, she knew. But if there were men being held in that rail yard, they could not simply leave them there. And if there was proof of Crowley's crimes, it would be there as well. Whitcomb stroked his sooty beard, his expression grim. The rail yard was guarded day and night. He warned, getting in would be difficult. Getting out with proof or with people would be nearly impossible. Miguel, his youthful bravado tempered by the memory of the dust storm, said that he could create a distraction on the far side of town. He could spook some horses, get the guards running. Atza listened to them all, his gaze moving from face to face. When they had finished, he shook his head slowly. A distraction would put the entire yard on alert. He said they needed the opposite. They needed silence and darkness. He had watched the guards. He knew their patrol routes, knew the moments when the night was at its deepest and the watch was at its laziest. They would go in when the town was dead asleep, in the heavy, moonless hours just before dawn. He looked at Ruth Ann. He asked her if she had any lard, the kind she used for her biscuits. The question was so unexpected, so domestic in the middle of their tense planning, that she could only stare at him for a moment. She nodded, confused. He explained that the hinges on a boxcar door were heavy and rusted. They would scream when opened. But lard, applied carefully, would silence them. And so, the plan was set. It was a plan built on their unique strengths, Atza's knowledge of stealth, Miguel's quick feet, and Ruth Ann's practical, kitchen-born wisdom. The night they chose was black and starless, with a low ceiling of clouds that swallowed what little light there was. They moved like spirits through the sleeping town, their boots making no sound on the dusty ground. Atza led the way, a shadow among shadows. Miguel followed, his earlier nervousness replaced by a focused intensity. Ruth Ann came last, a small pot of lard clutched in one hand and a bundle of clean cloths in the other. The training Atza had given her had sharpened her senses. She noticed the way the air shifted as they passed an alleyway, the faint scent of stale beer from the saloon, the different textures of darkness. The rail yard fence was their first obstacle. Atza led them not to the gate, but to the same spot he had used before, where a loose board could be pried away from its post. He slipped through the opening without a sound, and the others followed. They were inside. The yard was a maze of tracks and silent, hulking train cars. The air smelled of cold steel, creosote, and engine smoke. A single lantern burned in the station master's office 50 yards away, a solitary yellow eye in the oppressive darkness. Miguel took his position behind a stack of barrels, his job to watch that light, to watch for the slow, predictable circuit of the single-night guard. Atza led Ruth Ann along a line of freight cars, his hand occasionally resting on her arm to guide her in the pitch black. He stopped beside a long, windowless boxcar that stood on an isolated siding, away from the others. This was it. It had a heavy, cross-beam door, secured by a thick, formidable lock. Miguel gave a soft whistle, the call of a night bird, so faint it was almost part of the wind. The guard was at the far end of his patrol. It was time. Ruth Ann stepped forward, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dipped her fingers into the cool, soft lard and began to work it carefully, silently, into the grooves of the large iron hinges. It was a strange, intimate act, anointing this iron beast of a door as if preparing it for a ritual. She packed the grease deep into the joints, her fingers moving with the same sureness they used to knead dough. When she was finished, she gave Atza a nod. He produced a long, thin piece of steel, a pry bar he had taken from Whitcomb's shop. He did not attack the lock itself, but the hasp that held it. He found the point where the wood of the door was weakest, where the screws had been driven in. and he began to apply a slow, steady pressure. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then came a faint, groaning sound of stressed wood, followed by a sharp crack that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the silent yard. They all froze, listening, but the wind sighed, and from the station office, there was no sign of alarm. The lock and the broken hasp hung uselessly. The door was free. Atsa put his shoulder to the heavy door and pushed. Thanks to Ruth Ann's work, it swung open with only a deep, groaning whisper of protest. The smell that rolled out of the darkness within was sickening. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness, and of despair. Atsa lit a small, shielded lantern, and its weak glow illuminated a scene from a nightmare. Half a dozen men were lying on thin, dirty straw. They were gaunt, their faces pale and unshaven in the flickering light. One man had a crudely bandaged leg that was dark with old blood. Another was coughing, a deep, rattling sound that spoke of a sickness in his lungs. These were the complainers, the dissenters, the men who had dared to ask for a fair wage. This boxcar was their prison. But there was more. In one corner of the car, stacked neatly, were several heavy canvas sacks. Atsa slit one open with his knife, and a stream of new, sharp-pointed railroad spikes poured out. They were identical to the ones that had been used to set the trap for them in the desert. In another corner stood a large wooden crate. Ruth Ann pried its lid open. It was filled with ledgers, payroll books for the railroad. She opened one. The pages were filled with names, followed by a list of wages paid. But the numbers were all wrong, inflated. This was Crowley's real gold mine. He was charging the railroad company for a full crew at high wages, while paying a fraction of that to the poor souls he had trapped in his work camps, and nothing at all to the men in this car. The final discovery was the most terrifying. Lined up against the back wall of the car were 3 large barrels. Atsa tapped one, then unstoppered the bung hole. He sniffed, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. It was lamp oil, a massive quantity of it. There was no reason for this much oil to be in a boxcar with prisoners, unless the plan was to get rid of the car, and the men inside it, in a way that would look like a tragic accident. A fire that would consume the men, the ledgers, and all the evidence of his crimes in one terrible blaze. They had to get these men out. Atsa spoke to the prisoners in a low, urgent voice. Some were too weak or too frightened to move, but 3 of them, including the man with the injured leg, struggled to their feet, their eyes burning with a desperate hope. Getting them out of the yard was a slow, agonizing process. They half-carried the injured man. His arms draped over the shoulders of Atsa and another prisoner. Every scrape of a boot, every pained grunt, felt like a shout in the stillness. Miguel met them at the fence, his eyes wide, and helped them through the opening. They hid the escaped men in a small, hidden cellar beneath Whitcomb's smithy, a place used for storing coal in the winter. The blacksmith met them with blankets and a jug of water, his face a grim testament to the ugly truth they had uncovered. The next day, a cold, quiet fury descended on Silas Crowley. He knew. He did not know who or how, but he knew his prison had been breached. He did not rage. He acted. Sheriff Boone and 3 of his deputies descended on the open kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, just as Ruth Ann was serving a thin but nourishing vegetable soup to a handful of families. Boone's face was a mask of smug authority. He announced that he had a warrant to search the premises for stolen railroad property. His men were deliberately rough, shoving aside the long table, kicking over a bucket of water. They stormed into the lean-to, pulling sacks of flour onto the floor, overturning crates of vegetables. The people who'd been eating their soup scattered, their fear of the law overriding their hunger. Ruth Ann stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but composed. The deputies found nothing. There was nothing to find. Her kitchen was a place of simple, honest provisions. Finally, one of the deputies, a brutish man with a mean streak, came to her small, neatly organized spice shelf. He picked up a jar of deep red chili powder, a gift from the old Mexican woman. Sheriff Boone strode over, a sneer on his face. He took the jar and held it up as if it were evidence of a great crime. He looked at Ruth Ann, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This stuff is potent enough to kill a man, I reckon." Ruth Ann met his gaze, her blue eyes as clear and steady as a winter sky. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She spoke, her voice not loud, but it cut through the tense silence of the violated kitchen with the clean authority of truth. "I only cook for people who want to live. Sheriff." The words hung in the air. It was a simple statement, but it was also a profound accusation. Boone's sneer faltered. For a moment, he had no reply. He was the law, but he was standing in service of a man who dealt in death, and this woman had just held up a mirror to his hollow soul. He slammed the jar down on the shelf, grunted an order to his men, and stomped out of the kitchen, leaving a mess of spilled flour and shattered dignity in his wake. The raid on the kitchen shattered the fragile piece of dead juniper. It was a public violation, a message from Silas Crowley that no space was safe from his reach. That night, a grim council was held in the coal cellar beneath the smithy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and fear. The 3 men they had freed from the boxcar were weak, but their eyes burned with a fire that had been rekindled by their rescue. They confirmed everything: the fraudulent ledgers, the stolen wages, the plan to burn the boxcar with them inside it. They now had witnesses, not just to Crowley's greed, but to his willingness to commit mass murder. But witnesses were useless if they were dead. Whitcomb stated the obvious, his voice a low rumble. They could not stay in town. Crowley and Boone would tear the place apart looking for these men. They had to move, and they had to do it now. Their departure was a quiet exodus under the cover of a mercifully dark and overcast sky. They were a small, strange caravan of fugitives. Atza led, moving with a silent confidence that seemed to push back the oppressive darkness. Miguel guided one of the smithy's pack horses, now laden with food, water, and blankets. Ruth Ann walked beside Emma June and Ruthie Bell, while Jonas helped support the weakest of the rescued men. Whitcomb remained behind, a grim sentinel promising to create whatever confusion he could when their absence was discovered at dawn. They traveled for hours, leaving the faint lights of dead juniper far behind, delving deep into the broken, rocky country that stretched to the east. The air grew heavy and humid, and the clouds that had hidden the stars began to weep. It started as a fine mist, a novelty in the parched land, but soon it turned into a steady, soaking rain. It was a rare, unseasonal storm, a blessing that would wash away their tracks, but a misery that chilled them to the bone. Just as their strength was beginning to fail, Atza led them into a narrow, winding canyon. The high stone walls offered a welcome respite from the wind and the driving rain. He found what he was looking for: a wide, deep overhang, a natural rock shelter that was almost a cave. The ground beneath it was dry sand, a small island in the wet, dripping world. They collapsed there, their exhaustion absolute, while Miguel tended to the horses, tethering them in the shelter of some hardy junipers. Atza managed to find dry wood deep within a crevice in the rock. Soon, he had a small, nearly smokeless fire going, its warmth a miracle in the damp chill. Ruth Ann unpacked her supplies and set a pot of coffee to brew. The familiar, comforting aroma filled their small sanctuary. The children, wrapped in dry blankets, huddled close to the flames, their earlier fear giving way to a bone-deep weariness. They ate a simple meal of cold cornbread and jerky, and one by one, the children and the rescued men drifted off to sleep, their bodies surrendering to the need for rest. The canyon was filled with the soft, rhythmic sounds of the falling rain and the gentle crackle of the fire. Miguel, his youthful energy finally spent, curled up near the horses and was asleep in moments. Only Ruth Ann and Atza remained awake, watching the flames dance, Their wet cloaks and coats were hung on outcroppings of rock near the fire, steaming gently in the heat. Ruth Ann could not settle. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear and anxiety. She kept thinking she heard sounds beyond the steady drumming of the rain, a distant clatter of a horseshoe on rock, a voice carried on the wind. She knew it was likely her imagination, the ghosts of their narrow escapes playing tricks on her ears. But the feeling of being hunted was a cold knot in her stomach. Crowley was not a man to let them get away. He would be searching. Atza watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He saw the way she kept glancing toward the mouth of the canyon, the way her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. He had been a scout. He knew the difference between a real threat and a phantom one. The rain, he knew, was their friend. It muffled sound, concealed scent, and would turn any pursuit into a miserable, muddy struggle. For tonight they were safe. He shifted his position, moving to sit with his back against the solid rock wall, facing the entrance to their shelter. He took his long hunting knife from its sheath and laid it on the saddlebag he was using as a pillow. The firelight glinted on the polished steel. He looked at Ruth Ann, his dark eyes calm and steady. "Go to sleep," he said, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the rain. "I will keep watch." His words were a simple statement of fact, a promise spoken with an absolute certainty that quieted some of the frantic noise in her mind. He was the guardian, the watcher in the dark. It was his nature. She should feel relieved. She should go and lie down near the children, find what rest she could. But she did not move. She sat there, a few feet from him, caught in a moment of profound hesitation. To sleep was to admit a level of trust she had never given to any man. It was an act of surrender, of placing her life and the lives of the children completely in his hands. He had earned that trust 100 times over, but this felt different. It was more than just the trust of one ally in another. It was a deeper, more personal yielding. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, the patience in his posture. He was not a man of easy words or empty gestures. Everything he did had weight, had meaning. He was like the desert itself, silent, enduring, and possessed of a deep, hidden life. Slowly, as if moving in a dream, she rose from her spot and moved to the space beside him. She settled on the sandy ground, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, her back just a few inches from the same stone wall he rested against. The warmth from his body was a faint but tangible presence in the cool, damp air. She sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Then she turned her head and spoke, her voice a near whisper, a fragile question offered up into the intimate darkness. "Should I stay the night?" the virgin cook asked. Atza did not answer immediately. He turned his head and looked at her. The firelight played in her wide, uncertain eyes, and he saw everything there: her fear, her exhaustion, her stubborn courage, and the unspoken question that lay beneath the one she had just asked. He saw a woman who had been judged and wronged, who had fought with the only weapon she had, a cooking pot and a stubborn refusal to be broken. He saw her not as a burden to be protected, but as a partner who had stood beside him in a cloud of dust and fury. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The world seemed to shrink to the small, warm space between them, a sanctuary carved out of the storm and the night. Then, with a slow, deliberate gravity that was more binding than any spoken oath, he gave a single, solemn nod, and in that simple, silent gesture, he chose her forever. A profound sense of peace settled over Ruth Ann, a calm that seeped into her very bones. The anxious knot in her stomach dissolved. She had asked, and he had answered. She was no longer just an ally in his fight, or he in hers. They were in this place together. She hesitantly reached out her hand, and he met it with his own. His hand was hard and calloused, a warrior's hand, but his grip was gentle. He enfolded her smaller, softer hand, calloused from years of kitchen work, and held it. It was not a gesture of passion, but of quiet, profound connection. It was an anchor in the storm. They sat like that in silence for a long time, their hands clasped, listening to the music of the rain on stone. Then he began to speak, his voice as low and steady as a deep river current. He told her of his childhood, of how his mother had taught him to be silent and listen. She would take him to the great rock formations of his homeland and tell him to press his ear against the stone. If you were patient enough, she had said, you could hear the water running deep inside, a secret life hidden within the rock. That, she had told him, was where the real strength of the land came from. Not from the noisy things on the surface, but from the slow, persistent, hidden life within. When he finished, the silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now, filled with the weight of the memory he had shared. After a moment, Ruth Ann spoke, her own voice soft with remembrance. She told him of her own home, a place of green hills and cold winters so different from this land. She spoke not of hardship or the reasons she had left, but of the smell of her mother's kitchen on a baking day. She described the scent of yeast and flour, of cinnamon and melting butter, the warm, life-affirming aroma of fresh bread coming out of the oven. It was the smell of safety. She said, the smell of a place where you knew you belonged. They shared these simple, fundamental pieces of themselves, the memories that had shaped them into the people they were. He, the man who had learned to find life in the barren stone, and she, the woman who created life and comfort from simple flour and fire, in that small, fire-lit shelter, surrounded by the sleeping forms of the children they were protecting. Their two different worlds, their two different kinds of strength, finally and completely intertwined. They were a team, and they would face the dawn, and whatever it brought, together. They returned to dead juniper under a sky that had been washed clean by the rain. The air was crisp, and the red dust that normally coated every surface had been turned to a dark, damp clay. The town felt scrubbed, but the clean facade could not hide the sickness that festered beneath it. Their plan was a desperate gamble, a single, decisive strike at the heart of Silas Crowley's power. It was market day, the one day of the week when the entire scattered community of ranchers, prospectors, and homesteaders would converge on the town's main street. It was their only chance to present their case not to a corrupt sheriff, but to the court of public opinion. Whitcomb had sent word via a friendly freight driver, confirming the timing. He and Miguel had spent the day before their return making quiet preparations, their movements cloaked by the normal hustle and bustle of the smithy. The three rescued men remained hidden in the canyon, guarded by a trusted Navajo acquaintance of Atsa's. They were the last resort, the living proof. But to bring them into town would be to sentence them to death. The evidence they had taken from the boxcar, the ledgers, a sack of the distinctive spikes, and one of the heavy barrels of oil had been carefully hidden in an old, abandoned wagon behind the smithy. As the morning sun climbed higher, Ruth Ann set up her station in the very center of the town square. It was bolder than her previous kitchen, more deliberate. She laid a long, clean plank across two barrels, creating a serving table. On a large, open fire pit, a massive pot of chili simmered, its rich, spicy aroma drifting through the marketplace, a scent of warmth and sustenance that cut through the usual market smells of livestock and dry goods. Beside it, a stack of fresh, golden cornbread was piled high. She had hung a simple, hand-painted sign on a post beside her table. It did not list a price. It just said, a full bowl for an honest story. It was an invitation and a challenge. Atsa was not visible, but she could feel his presence. She knew he was somewhere nearby, in the deep shadows of an alleyway or on the roof of the general store, watching everything. A silent, hawk-eyed guardian. The children sat on a bench a few feet away, tasked with keeping the flies off the cornbread. Their presence was a stark, visual reminder of what this fight was about. At first, the townspeople were wary. They walked past her table, their gazes curious but averted. They had seen what Sheriff Boone had done to her kitchen, and they were afraid. But hunger was a powerful motivator. A few of the railroad men, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow, were the first to approach. They had no honest stories to tell, only the shared, unspoken story of their oppression. Ruth Ann filled their bowls without asking for a word, and they ate with a desperate gratitude, standing in a small, huddled group. Then, a few of the local Mexican families came, followed by a handful of grizzled prospectors. Soon, a small crowd had gathered around her table. They did not speak of Crowley or the sheriff. They spoke of the poor harvest, of a sick child, of the rising prices at Lydia Cooper's store. Ruth Ann listened to each one, her expression a mixture of compassion and quiet resolve. And for every story, she gave a bowl of chili and a piece of bread. Her table had become the town's confessional, its heart. From the window of her store, Lydia Cooper watched the sight of the communal table, of the different faces, white, Mexican, Navajo, all sharing the same food, stirred a complex mixture of feelings within her. It was disorderly. It was improper, but it was also undeniably decent. She remembered Ruth Ann offering bread to the man who had threatened her, and the shame she had felt then returned. She saw the quiet dignity with which Ruth Ann ladled out the chili, and for the first time, Lydia began to question the rigid, fearful order she had always clung to. The inevitable confrontation arrived just before noon. 4 of Crowley's men, the same brutish guards from the rail yard, swaggered through the marketplace. They were not there to eat. They pushed their way to the front of the line, their expressions a mixture of contempt and menace. One of them, a big man with a scar on his cheek, sneered at Ruth Ann. He said that he had heard she was giving away free food. He wondered if it was poisoned. Ruth Ann continued to serve a woman, her hands not trembling in the slightest. She answered without looking at him, her voice clear and calm for all to hear. She said that she only used fresh ingredients. The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He deliberately knocked a bowl of chili from another man's hand, splattering the hot food across the ground. He stated that the town had laws against vagrancy and unlicensed street vendors. He declared her table was a public nuisance. Before Ruth Ann could respond, Sheriff Asa Boone appeared, as if on cue. He strode into the center of the square, his hand resting on his pistol, his face a mask of official outrage. He loudly proclaimed that he had received numerous complaints. He pointed a finger at Ruth Ann. He was placing her under arrest for inciting a public disturbance and endangering the health of the community. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was a travesty, a blatant abuse of power, but they were too afraid to protest. They had seen what happened to those who crossed the sheriff. Boone took a step toward Ruth Ann, reaching for her arm. At that moment, a new voice cut through the tense silence. "That is not true, Sheriff?" Every head turned. The words had come from the doorway of the general store. Lydia Cooper stood there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face pale but her expression resolute. She took a step forward, onto the boardwalk. "I have been watching all morning," she said, her voice shaking slightly but carrying across the square. "This woman has done nothing but feed hungry people." "But I have seen these men." She pointed a trembling finger at Crowley's guards. "Threatening her. I have heard them myself. They are the ones causing the disturbance." Boone was stunned into silence. He had always counted on the silent complicity of the town's respectable citizens. Lydia Cooper was the very pillar of that respectability. Her speaking out was a betrayal he could not comprehend. As he stood there, momentarily speechless, a new sound began to build from the far end of the street. It was a low rumbling, a frantic clatter of hooves and the groaning of a heavy wagon moving far too fast. "Get out of the way!" a voice yelled. It was Miguel. He was in the driver's seat of the old wagon from behind the smithy, sawing at the reins, his face a mask of theatrical panic. The two horses were at a full gallop, and the heavy wagon was careening down the main street, directly toward the crowded market square. People screamed and scrambled to get out of its path. The wagon hit a deep rut just in front of Ruth Ann's table, the one Miguel had spent a good part of the morning digging. The front axle snapped with a loud crack. The heavy wagon slewed sideways, its momentum carrying it forward until it tipped and crashed onto its side with a deafening splintering of wood. The rear doors, which had been deliberately weakened, burst open. The contents of the wagon spilled out across the center of the square in a chaotic, damning tide. The heavy ledgers tumbled through the dust, their pages flapping open to reveal columns of names and figures. The canvas sack of railroad spikes split open, scattering the distinctive, custom-forged metal across the ground, and the large, dark barrel of lamp oil rolled out, coming to a stop with a heavy thud, its bunghole plug popping loose and a dark, greasy stain beginning to spread in the red dirt. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The townspeople stared at the wreckage, at the strange collection of objects now lying at their feet. They did not yet understand what they were seeing. Then, Old Man Whitcomb stepped forward from the crowd, a heavy blacksmith's hammer held loosely in his hand. He stooped and picked up one of the railroad spikes. He held it high for everyone to see. "I have seen these spikes before," he roared, his voice booming with the authority of his trade. "They come from the crates in Silas Crowley's warehouse. He has a private stamp on them." He then pointed the spike toward the spilled ledgers. "And I will bet my forge that these books tell the real story of the wages he has been stealing from every man who ever swung a pick for him." The pieces clicked into place. The murmuring of the crowd began to swell, a low rumble of confusion turning into a wave of comprehension, and then into a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. They had been cheated, lied to, and intimidated. And here was the proof, spilled out in the dirt for all to see. From the doorway of the saloon, Silas Crowley, who had been watching the scene unfold, turned to slip away. But the crowd saw him. A man shouted, "There he is! Do not let him get away!" The crowd surged forward, their fear finally burned away by their anger. Sheriff Boone, his face white with panic, drew his pistol. "Stop!" he screamed. "Stop! In the name of the law!" He ordered his deputies to draw their weapons. They fired 2 shots into the air. The loud cracks of the pistols momentarily halted the crowd, but it only stoked their fury. In that instant of hesitation, Atza moved. He dropped from the roof of the building behind Ruth Ann's table, landing as silently as a cat. In his hand, he held a small, smoldering bundle of cloth. With a quick, powerful motion, he threw it into the embers of Ruth Ann's cooking fire. The bundle contained a fistful of the dried, crushed chili peppers that the old Mexican woman had given her. It erupted in a thick, acrid cloud of choking, blinding smoke. The wind caught the pungent plume and carried it directly into the faces of the sheriff and his deputies. They began to cough violently, their eyes streaming with tears. The crowd, caught on the edge of the smoke, recoiled, their own eyes burning. The square was thrown into a state of absolute, chaotic confusion. Through the swirling, stinging smoke, Atza grabbed Ruth Ann's arm. He shoved the children toward a narrow alleyway between the general store and the assayer's office. "Come," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Now is our time." He pulled them into the alley, leaving the town of Dead Juniper to finally reckon with the man who had been slowly poisoning it from within. Behind them, the sounds of shouting, coughing, and a rising, collective roar of a people who had finally found their voice, echoed in the smoky air. The chaos in the market square was a smokescreen, a churning, blinding fog of human fury and chili powder. In that moment of pandemonium, Silas Crowley saw his empire crumbling into the red dust. His power had always depended on the town's fear and silence, and both had just been shattered. He did not run from the mob. He faded into the confusion, a predator retreating to his true lair, with Sheriff Boone and his 2 most loyal gunmen following like jackals at his heel. Atza's grip on Ruth Ann's arm was firm, but not painful. He guided her and the children through the choking smoke and into the narrow alleyway. The roar of the crowd behind them was a terrifying, liberating sound. Miguel was right behind them, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They did not stop. Atza knew exactly where Crowley was going. There was only one place left for him to run. One final, desperate move he could make. He was going to the rail yard to erase the evidence. He was going to burn it all. Their path was a frantic, scrambling race through the backways of dead juniper. The ground was slick with mud from the morning's rain, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and distant, angry smoke. They could hear the mob surging toward the saloon, but Atza did not lead them that way. He led them toward the edge of town, toward the skeletal silhouette of the high trestle bridge that spanned the deep, dark chasm known as Devil's Split. The bridge was Crowley's masterpiece, the iron and timber artery that was meant to pump wealth from the territory directly into his pockets. Now, it was to be the stage for his final act of destruction. As they cleared the last of the town's buildings, they saw them. Crowley and his men were already on the bridge, their dark figures stark against the gray, overcast sky. They were gathered around the lone boxcar, the one that had been their prison. It had been moved from its siding and pushed out onto the center of the bridge. The setting was a nightmare of precarious heights and treacherous footing. The heavy wooden planks between the rails were dark and slick with rainwater. The steel rails themselves gleamed with a damp, dangerous sheen. 100 feet below, the jagged rocks of the ravine waited in shadow. A cold wind moaned through the trestles, a mournful, hollow sound. Crowley's men were working with a desperate haste. One was splashing the contents of a barrel along the wooden base of the bridge, the dark liquid gleaming. It was the lamp oil. The other was attaching a long fuse to the boxcar itself. Crowley stood watching them, his fine coat flapping in the wind. A man orchestrating the destruction of his own legacy to save himself. When he saw Atza, Ruth Ann, and the others emerge from the brush at the edge of the bridge, a terrible smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of amusement, but of pure, malevolent satisfaction. This was even better than he had planned. "You are just in time," he shouted, his voice carrying on the wind. "You can be the guests of honor at the grand finale. A tragic fire, started by a hysterical mob. Such a pity the cook and the children were caught on the bridge when it went up." He gestured to one of his gunmen, a lean, hard-faced man who drew his pistol with a fluid motion. He was aiming not at Atza, but at Ruth Ann. Crowley's plan was clear. He would create his accident, and she would be its primary victim. Atza did not wait. He launched himself forward, running onto the bridge with a speed and silence that was unnerving. He moved not on the slippery planks, but on the narrow, wet steel of the rail itself, his balance impossibly perfect. He was a blur of motion, closing the distance to the gunman before the man could properly aim. The gunman, startled by the direct assault, fired. The shot went wide, the bullet screaming off the iron trestle with a high-pitched whine. Atza was on him a second later. The fight that followed was a brutal, desperate dance on a knife's edge. They swayed and grappled on the narrow, wet beams, the deep ravine yawning below them. The gunman had a knife, and he slashed wildly, forcing Atza to give ground. Atza used a leather rein he had taken from one of the horses, snapping it like a whip to keep the man off balance, the wet leather making a sharp, cracking sound. Every slip, every lunge, threatened to send one or both of them plummeting into the abyss. While Atza was engaged, the second gunman, a burly man with a heavy mustache, turned his attention to the others. Miguel, his youthful courage overriding his sense, charged forward to intercept him. The man simply backhanded him, sending the boy staggering backward onto the slick planks. The gunman raised his pistol to finish him. Ruth Ann screamed Miguel's name. In her hand, she still clutched the small provision sack she had brought to the market. It was nearly empty, but it was not useless. Her mind, honed by years of improvisation in the kitchen, saw not a weapon, but ingredients. With a desperate, fluid motion, she flung the last of the sack's contents, a double handful of coarse salt and fine flour, directly into the gunman's face. He roared in pain and surprise, dropping his pistol as he clawed at his stinging, blinded eyes. The cloud of white powder hung in the damp air for a moment like a ghostly apparition. He stumbled backward, disoriented, trying to clear his vision. Ruth Ann then took the small pot of lard she had used to grease the skillet and, with a flick of her wrist, emptied its contents onto the wet wooden planks directly in his path. The grease spread, invisible on the damp wood. The gunman took another staggering step backward, his heavy boot hitting the slick, greasy patch. His feet went out from under him as if he had stepped on sheer ice. He pinwheeled his arms, trying to regain his balance, but it was useless. He crashed to the deck of the bridge with a heavy, bone-jarring thud, his head striking the steel rail. He lay still. Ruth Ann stood breathing heavily, her face as white as the flour she had just thrown, a cook who had won a battle with the tools of her trade. Across the bridge, the town had not been idle. The sound of the first gunshot had drawn the angriest and bravest of the mob out of the town and toward the rail yard. Leading them was Old Man Whitcomb, his heavy hammer in his hand, his face set like granite. With him was Lydia Cooper, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a newfound fire. They arrived at the edge of the bridge in time to see Sheriff Boone, who had been cowering behind Crowley, see his chance. Atza was locked in a deadly struggle, his back momentarily turned. Boone raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the center of Atza's back. "No, you do not!" Lydia Cooper screamed, her voice high and piercing with fury. The unexpected shout made Boone flinch, a fractional hesitation that saved Atza's life. In that same instant, the loud, deep boom of Whitcomb's heavy rifle echoed through the canyon. It was not a shot to kill, but a shot to disarm. The pistol flew from Boone's hand, spinning through the air before clattering onto the planks. Its grip shattered. The sheriff stared at his stinging, empty hand, his face a mask of utter disbelief and terror. Seeing his entire plan collapsing, his men defeated, and the townspeople closing in, Silas Crowley was consumed by a final, nihilistic rage. If he was going down, he would take everything with him. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on the wet rail, and touched the flame to the oil-soaked fuse leading to the boxcar. The fuse sputtered to life, a small, sizzling snake of fire racing along the planks toward the car filled with barrels of lamp oil. Atza saw it. He ended his own fight with a brutal, decisive move, hooking the rein around his opponent's ankle and pulling, sending the man crashing to the deck. He did not wait to see him fall. He ran, his feet sure on the slippery rail, a desperate race against the burning fuse. He reached the coupling that attached the boxcar to a single, stationary flat car. It was a heavy iron pin, held in place by a thick rope tie. His knife was in his hand. He did not try to pull the pin. There was no time. He began to saw at the thick, wet rope, his arm a blur of motion. The fuse was only feet from the boxcar. The fibers of the rope parted, one by one. With a final, desperate slash, the rope gave way. Atza put his shoulder to the corner of the boxcar and heaved with all his strength. The heavy car groaned, its iron wheels protesting. It moved, just an inch at first, then a foot. It was free. The burning fuse reached the boxcar just as it began to roll slowly toward the edge of the damaged section of the bridge where the tracks ended. The car tipped, its great weight pulling it over the edge. It hung in the air for a single, heart-stopping second, and then it plunged into the depths of the ravine. The world erupted in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar. A massive ball of fire blossomed from the canyon, a brilliant, terrible orange flower that lit up the gray sky and sent a wave of heat washing over the bridge. It was a sun, born and dying in the same instant, a final, fiery punctuation to all of Crowley's lies and greed. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a great, cleansing thunder. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, a new sound began. It was the gentle patter of rain, returning to extinguish the last of the flames. The brief, violent fire was over. On the bridge, the scene was a tableau of defeat and victory. Silas Crowley stood alone, his face illuminated by the dying glow from the chasm below. His fine clothes singed, his expression utterly vacant. He was a king in a ruined kingdom of one. Sheriff Boone slowly, deliberately, knelt on the wet planks, his hands raised in surrender. The townspeople, led by Whitcomb and Lydia, swarmed onto the bridge, their faces a mixture of awe, terror, and righteous fury. The evidence was now a plume of black smoke rising from the canyon. But the crime had been committed in the open, for all to see. The truth, finally, was undeniable. The fire in the canyon was a funeral pyre for the old dead juniper. In its aftermath, the town seemed to take its first clean breath in years. The arrival of a traveling circuit judge a week later was a formality, a legal stamp on a verdict the town had already delivered. The spilled ledgers, the custom ammunition confirmed by Whitcomb, and the collective testimony of a town that had finally found its voice were an avalanche of evidence. Silas Crowley, his arrogance finally shattered, and Asa Boone, a hollowed-out man stripped of his badge and his bluster, were tried, convicted, and sent away in irons to a territorial prison from which they would never return. The town did not celebrate with a party in the saloon. The saloon itself, now ownerless, stood dark and quiet. Instead, the celebration was a slow, steady, and deliberate act of rebuilding. The first thing they rebuilt was the open kitchen. It became the town's new center, its true heart. With lumber salvaged from one of Crowley's half-finished sheds and labor provided by the very railroad men he had once cheated, a permanent structure was raised behind the smithy. It was not fancy. It had a long, sturdy roof, open sides to catch the breeze, and a large stone hearth that seemed to radiate a constant, gentle warmth. Ruth Ann was its unquestioned proprietor, but she was not its owner. The kitchen belonged to everyone. A new sign, painted by Lydia Cooper in neat, careful letters, was hung from the main beam. It read, "The Juniper Table. Eat first, talk later." It became a place of quiet miracles. Lydia, her face softened by a humility she had never known, began stocking the kitchen's pantry from her own store, her penance a silent, daily delivery of flour, sugar, and coffee. Miguel, his youthful energy now channeled into a passionate apprenticeship, became Ruth Ann's right hand, learning the rhythms of the kitchen, his laughter a constant, welcome music. The three children, Jonas, Emma June, and Ruthie Bell, were formally adopted not by a single family, but by the town itself. They were enrolled in the small, one-room schoolhouse that had been reopened with funds that were no longer being funneled into Crowley's pockets. Atza did not work in the kitchen, but his hand was everywhere. One afternoon, he appeared with several long, curved pieces of wood, the salvaged ribs of the wagon Miguel had crashed. With a quiet, focused skill, he fashioned them into the framework for a wide awning that extended from the front of the kitchen, creating a generous patch of deep, welcome shade from the relentless Arizona sun. He worked without speaking, his movements economical and precise, building a shelter for the community he had helped to save. Life settled into a new rhythm, one governed not by fear, but by the predictable cycles of sunrise and sunset, of planting and harvesting, of a pot of beans set to simmer in the morning and a loaf of bread pulled from the oven in the afternoon. At the Juniper Table, no one was ever asked what they could pay, what language they spoke, or what God they prayed to. A person's only currency was their hunger, and it was always accepted. One late afternoon, as the sun began to dip toward the red rock horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the town, Ruth Ann was wiping down the long wooden tables, preparing for the evening meal. The air was cool, and the scent of roasting chili and baking cornbread promised comfort and community. Atsa approached her from the stables, leading a gentle mare that he had been teaching her to ride. In his hands, he held a new set of reins, the leather soft and expertly braided. He stood before her for a moment, the setting sun catching the sharp, proud lines of his face. He held out the reins. He did not ask a question or make a grand declaration. He simply spoke 2 words, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was more profound than any poem. Time to go home. Ruth Ann looked from his dark, steady eyes to the new reins, a symbol of a shared journey. She looked around at the open kitchen, at the long tables where a town had been reborn, at the shelter of the awning he had built. She thought of the long, hard road that had brought her to this dusty, improbable place. She had come west seeking a place to stand on her own, and instead, she had found a place to stand with others. She had found a home. She reached out and took the reins, her fingers brushing his. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unburdened contentment. "Home is where the stew never burns," she said. He did not smile, but a deep, quiet warmth kindled in his eyes. He took the mare's bridle, and together they walked away from the kitchen, their 2 shadows stretching long behind them in the golden light. 2 solitary figures who had found their home not in a place, but in each other, high above, in the vast, silent canvas of the desert sky. A lone hawk circled on the warm updrafts from the red rocks, its wings spread wide. Down below, on one of the empty tables, a clean white kitchen cloth, forgotten in the day's work, fluttered in the evening breeze. It was a small, unassuming flag of truce, a testament to the quiet, stubborn power of a simple meal and an open hand. Their love was not a sudden fire, but a slow, steady warmth, a choice they would remake every morning, with every shared task, with every bowl of stew offered and accepted. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the trials and triumphs of the Old West. I invite you to share where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts on the story. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button, helping these stories reach a wider audience.